continue on from the field and show you some examples of how we collaborate in the field, both with peers and colleagues and students and local communities as collaborators in this research. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we also collaborate in the laboratory and kind of some of the differences with those different types of collaborations. So one of the first things I wanted to start off with was the idea of identifying who is a collaborator and how do you manage collaborations in different sites and with different different types of scientists or peers. So we have collaborators here at Emory. There are scientists that we collaborate with in the chemistry department, or even over in pediatrics, we collaborate with virologists. How do we collaborate with peers at different universities, other scientists in different fields? Different countries. I have collaborators that don't speak English, and we have to communicate through different languages. So what are some of the pros and cons of that? Students, trainees, mentors, communities, especially with, in our work, we're documenting Indigenous knowledge of how they use the environment for health. A true collaboration with community leaders and members is important. And then journalists. I put this up there because I'm really passionate about communication of science to the public. And I think that often scientists are maybe a little bit fearful of talking with journalists. And I think if we perhaps reframe our mindset of approaching them as collaborators in getting our message out, that can help to change that kind of relationship. There are different collaborators for different roles. Again, we're going to talk about field science, lab science, and then finding the right experts. How do you find the right people that can complement your skill set and fill gaps? And then importantly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the gender gap and gender in the balance, especially when it comes to parity in workload and how to monitor that not only with your colleagues and people that are perhaps ranked higher than you, but also how do you monitor that within the students that you're training to ensure that people don't get put into boxes of what their duties are in a specific project. Our approach is very multidisciplinary, which is exciting, but also opens up a lot of challenges. So we're going from research in the field. This is a photo of me that one of my collaborators took on a mountaintop range in Albania. We have collaborators that are botanists that work through the herbarium. I have team members that do chemistry, and I have team members that do microbiology and cell culture. And what we try and do is find leads for drug discovery and then complement any gaps we have in knowledge, for example, on the very specific genetics of certain pathogens that we're targeting by working with experts in that specific pathogen. So bringing together translational applications of basic science in a unified way. Now, I wanted to bring this up. If you haven't seen this yet, I'd encourage you to take a look at this article. It really brings out some of the horrible things that can happen in places of isolation, especially in the field. So physical isolation at field sites where you have very large power dynamics can go very wrong very easily. And I think, as a PI, I have to worry about that when I'm in the field about safety, but I'm also want to make sure that my students and that my team are safe and that we don't have these sorts of inappropriate things happening in the field where you don't necessarily have another person you can report to in these scenarios. And in this case, in particular, the lead scientist was the perpetrator or the alleged perpetrator. So any collaboration requires development of trust, both for fieldwork and lab work. You have to have trust. And how do you protect yourself, especially in a new collaboration? And I'm talking about physical and intellectual protection. So I have collaborators, again, in different countries, at different universities. When it comes to inter-university or inter-institution collaborations, there are a number of resources that Emory has on how you can legally come up with collaborative research agreements or material transfer agreements. This is really important because from the very get-go, you're defining what the scope of your project is, and it helps protect any ideas that you're developing or you're co-developing together and sets out expectations for how this collaboration will work so that you don't, in the end, especially in drug discovery, have another team take your drug and run with it without having you involved. Through what office? This is through the Office of Technology Transfer. Some other things to think about is know when to stay and when to go. Not all collaborations end with happy rainbows and butterflies and unicorns, right? Sometimes you have to know when, you know what, this is really not working for me. And I think that open communication from the very beginning is very important. And making yourself accessible to team members so that if you are in a team, whether you're leading students into the field or whether you're working with other colleagues from different institutions, that you make yourself accessible to speak to, and pay attention to these power dynamics. So I wanted to show you some examples of what it looks like when we do our field work. We work in a number of different places, both from the Southeast U.S. and especially in the Mediterranean basin and into the Balkans. And our approach is basically we're taking biological diversity. There are around 450,000 species of plants on Earth. We're using human knowledge and practice to narrow down that scope of which plants to actually do our drug discovery work on. And then we're documenting these plants through botanical research. We are extracting them through chemical research, and we're testing them through microbiological research. And hopefully we'll be working with clinicians in the future to get these tested once the compounds are refined in humans. So there are multiple areas where you're going to have very different experts working together on a given project. Now, in the field, I want you to look at this picture and think about who are the collaborators in these pictures. These are some shots of, on the upper left is, I don't know which, we're in Albania, planting potatoes with some of the local women. Here I've got some students from the pharmacy program at the University of Pristina in Kosovo and an informant. Here's an elderly informant from Italy, from Kosovo, and Albania. So who here is the collaborator? All of them. They're all collaborators. I think that's really important to recognize that when you're working on this, you're really, we value the contributions of community members as much as we do our laboratory experts and physicians that we work with. And I don't have a picture of her here, but other faculty, Emory, like Maria Carrion, is also a valued collaborator. She helped to translate some of these old texts in Latin, which is something I'm not able to do. So there are many different ways to collaborate here. I just wanted to show you some images of what it looks like we're in the field. These are very rural places. This also happens to be a place where there are a lot of landmines from the Balkan conflict in the woods. So there are also issues where you have to ensure that safety is always on the forefront. This is a photo of one of my longtime collaborators, one of my most successful collaborations that's been going on now for 16 years. We met when I was not even in grad school. He was a postdoc, and we started our first field trip in 2001 in southern Italy. And our careers have both progressed, and he is one that I still feel incredibly comfortable working with in the field. And there are advantages when it comes to gender of having a male collaborator in the field because he has access to the men in the bars, which I can't necessarily enter in some cultures. It's not appropriate for me to be there, whereas I have better access to the young girls and older women that love to talk to me. So there's a way to use gender strategically in these collaborations as well to be more culturally appropriate. And here's just some examples of us interviewing people, observing. This is a kind of they're pulling out the potatoes after being stored for a whole winter, and then speaking with people. Now, let's talk about students and training. So in this case, this is from a trip where we did a university capacity building project that was actually funded by the U.S. State Department in Kosovo. And here we were training students in how to do ethnobotanical research. There's a collaborator at the university, professor that we worked closely with on this project. And we also engage what we call access and benefit sharing, where not only are we going and helping them with their training, but they're also coming over here. We have high levels of academic exchange. This is another long and ongoing collaboration with folks in Kosovo. Now, this summer, I had the great fortune to work on the Agadian Islands. And this brings another dynamic. These are not my students, they're my children. And being a mom in the field is a whole other area to think about. If I'm gone for 3 months of the summer doing field research, I can't just leave my children behind. And so that brings in other dynamics. Are your collaborators comfortable in working with basically a family unit in the field? And, I've been very fortunate in identifying those that are. And this is an example of This is Alfonso. He's a naturalist, an expert on the flora of Sicily. He can name things down to the exact species and subspecies just walking along. It's amazing. And I didn't believe him at first since I started keying things out and realized, wow, he's spot on every time. Great person to collaborate with. Alessandro is an expert in fungi. So I don't know anything about identification of fungi, and so that's his role. So we're each bringing in new aspects to the team. And these are just some pictures of what it's like working on these islands. And then here's an example of a photojournalist. So there was a German journalist team, a writer and a photographer embedded with us for part of the trip. And so we had to develop trust to make sure they're going to behave appropriately in the community and with us and with our team. And it's really about developing a collaboration with them to ensure that the science is correct in the ultimate magazine piece, right? Now, with working with local people, again, we're importantly follow codes of ethics, and we engage in access and benefit sharing. And some examples of that beyond the student cross-training is that we also try and return knowledge back to these communities in a format that's understandable to them, right? So this is what I would also want to do in an academic collaboration is that we have parity in the workload, but also parity in the sharing of resources and benefits. And this also extends to these communities. Working with students in the field is always fun. This is a shot from some work we did in Florida with students. And again, another dynamic, but I think that incredibly valuable to see how excited they can get about science and to also have the opportunity to train them and see them grow as collaborators. In the lab, I just wanted to highlight two instances quickly of lab research. This is one of my collaborators formerly at University of Iowa. He's now at Denver, and he's an expert in how bacteria communicate together. And we had drugs that stop how bacteria communicate. And so this has been an example of a really successful collaboration. We had an RO1 together. He was a co-investigator on, and we were able to discover some new chemicals that work in this pathway. And here at Emory, we've also collaborated with chemists. I worked with Emily Weinert and asked her to basically build some molecules based off of things that we had found in nature, and so that we could scale up production and do additional testing. So that was a really productive collaboration. So the lessons learned here are identify your strengths and gaps in knowledge, and then find collaborators that can bridge those gaps. I think from the very get-go, frank clarity over your expectations can prevent the development of mistrust, distrust, and kind of bad feelings in a collaboration. And especially keep in mind these ideas of power dynamics, communicate clearly and frequently. And, when I talk about parity, you also have to be cognizant of carrying your own weight, of not pushing off too much on your collaborators to really have a fair sharing of work. Also learn when to say no. I have a lot of people that want to collaborate with me, and there's only so many collaborations you can effectively manage, because if you take on too many, you're not doing your other collaborators a good service and having a really productive experience. And then mind the gender gap. It's very easy for people to fall into these kind of traditional gendered roles. I also watch this in my lab. Part of the student duties are dishwashing and cleaning of the lab, and I often see it's the girls that are doing that, and I'm very on top of that. I said, no, boys have to wash dishes too. Everybody's expected to carry their weight, even with the more menial tasks. And I think as a leader in a group, that's really important that you emphasize parity. And then lead through example to teach your trainees. And so I'm wearing another example of how we collaborate. I just want to show you this little clips of students. So we're working with students now to raise funding for their independent research projects. These are outside of our general lab projects. So they designed this t-shirt with all these plant chemicals, and it says thank a plant for that. And they have a fundraiser going on right now. So this is also, a way that we're working together. Even students that don't have their own projects yet are helping to promote this so they can help their peers raise funding they need for their supplies for their independent projects. So I'll leave it at that.